Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Jenna and I am the producer for the Roxborough House Roundtables at Jefferson East Falls. Each episode is recorded and later posted on our YouTube and SoundCloud for those who were not able to make it to the live event. They are also aired on the first and third Sundays of each month from 7 to 8 a.m. on G-Town Radio 92.5 FM WGGT. Today's roundtable is hosted by Thomas Jefferson faculty with moderator Marilisa Navarro, Assistant Professor of African American Studies, who will discuss the ongoing efforts to weaken diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in higher education. In recent years, many states have taken steps to limit DEI, and under Trump's second administration, these efforts are expanding. And now, open the floor.
Thank you. So I'm Marilisa Navarro. Hello, everyone. I am an assistant professor of African American Studies. I'm also the chair of the College of Humanities and Sciences Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and the assistant provost of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion as of this semester. So I'm going to start off the conversation, but we actually have a number of different speakers, faculty who are here, and we're all going to kind of do some group work, thinking together collaboratively. So I'll start off framing the conversation, and then I'll hand it over to the next person, and everyone can introduce themselves. And thanks for all of you for coming here and being here. So, we all know that the attacks on DEI are an effort to dismantle a sense of social inclusion, a sense of who belongs and who doesn't. And I want to offer a couple of other ways to think about it. So one is that these recent attacks and historic attacks have been efforts to also dismantle historical inequities, or an effort to dismantle organizations, structures, and practices that seek to address historical inequities, is what I was trying to say. So if we think about something like affirmative action, for example, right, whose effort has been historically, right, in different ways to address historical inequities in university settings, at workplaces, the dismantling of those sorts of things, right, is an effort to say these historical inequities don't actually exist, right, they don't actually matter. And so we can just do away with these sorts of programs because everyone is on an equal playing field, right? Which any kind of studies and anything having to do with DEI, we know that that is not true. Another way in which I think DEI is beyond just these individual attacks on states, policies, offices, is that it's really wholesale a way of trying to ban knowledge, right? Like, what do we know to be true and what do we think of as being legitimate? If we think about something like, my degree, my PhD is in ethnic studies, and in those classes we learn about all of these kinds of historical inequities towards people of color, towards women, towards those who are LGBTQ, right, towards people who are poor and working class. And so attacks at the university level, right, that are telling us we shouldn't continue to have these classes, we shouldn't continue to have women and gender studies classes, we shouldn't continue to have LGBTQ studies classes, essentially tell us that these histories don't matter. That they're irrelevant or illegitimate when we think about what it means to be quote unquote American and in this American system. And in taking away those things, right, then we take away knowledge, right? We take away history, things that are actually true, that we know are true. And they tell us that, in fact, they're not true, right? We don't actually need to know about these things. And that is, a huge issue, because we all know that knowledge is about allowing us to ask critical questions. It allows us to navigate our social worlds, it allows us to reflect on history so that we can have an accurate representation of history, but also so that we don't make, as the old adage says, right, the same mistakes moving forward. So I think attacks on DEI are not solely attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but are also attacks on what we know, and making attempts to essentially gaslight us, right, and to tell us that what we know to be true is not in fact true. I want to connect this back to book banning during slavery because of how it relates to ideas of banning knowledge. So during enslavement, there were bans on literacy, right, for people who were enslaved. And there were consequences to slaves who tried to read, who tried to learn how to write, for those who were trying to teach them how to read and write, for moments when folks were gathering in public spaces or private spaces in order to read and write, and if they were found out, they were punished, right, through fines, through lynchings, through whippings, and in some cases even through death, right? And so the thinking was, well, gathering through knowledge, right, gathering literacy could lead to rebellion. It could lead to protest. It could lead to folks banding together in solidarity and to actually making changes, right, within this institution of enslavement. And I think that we can, see some parallels here in the efforts to band the knowledge, right, that we learn through these DEI offices, classes, people who are, taking up particular positions. And there are penalties to those, right? Not the same ones, but financial ones that are really extreme, loss of jobs, and other kinds of punishments. So I'm gonna stop there for now and hand it over to, I think, Guanji is next.
Thank you. My name is Guanji Wang. I'm assistant professor of interdisciplinary studies of the College of Humanities and Sciences. I want to follow up on Marilisa's talk on history, offer another historical perspective on why the Trump administration is attacking DEI in especially higher education and how they have done it in the past. As Marilisa suggested, attacks on social progress and especially on racial injustice efforts to correct racial injustice is not new. Every time we have, in the history of this country, every time there was any major progress, equally strong backlash will follow, actually. If we think about, how the Civil War ended slavery, and then we entered, Jim Crow, right, racial segregation. And then we have brown people, the Civil Rights Movement, which is followed by, white flight, white Americans leaving cities, leaving African Americans trapped in inner cities, and then we had the war on drugs as well, right? And then we had the first black president in this country, which we now know is followed by 2 Trump terms, which try to undo a lot of the progress that actually Obama did not make. All the progress that the country has made in previous years. But I also want to talk about the strategies that conservatives use to undo some of these progress, by co-opting actually language of progressive movements. Slavery was premised on the notion that non-whites are racially, biologically inferior than the white race, right? Which was supposedly ended by the Civil War, but then this notion then was replaced by another notion, separate but equal. Basically, it says, we yield to the fact that yes, different races are biologically equal, but they should be separate. They should not, mingle. They cannot, should not cohabit, etc. This racial segregation then was ended by the Civil Rights Movement. Then we entered the age of color blindness, which individualizes the issue of racism, and pretending that systemic racism no longer existed. Now if we still have racists, there are individual flaws or problems, not systemic problems. Again, it's a way to undo correctional measures like affirmative action. So basically, it's saying, if you don't want race-based oppression, race-based, discrimination like, Jim Crow, then we don't want also race-based correctional measures as well, like, affirmative action. And that's why you see conservatives always use that one quote from MLK, the content of the character, always that quote, because it's that quote that emphasizes individual character, merits, that has been weaponized throughout this decades after the Civil Rights Movement. And the latest, application of this was, in the Supreme Court case which ended affirmative action in 2023. This case was brought by this student for fair admissions, which accused Harvard of, discriminating against Asian students. And they argue, quote here, before the court, that Harvard race-conscious emissions policy violated the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which bars discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. Again, they're co-opting the language of the civil rights movement, turn it on its head, and saying that affirmative action is basically a form of reverse racism, right? So now we have Trump, who calls DEI discriminatory, and actually on the White House's website, there are different fact sheets. One of them says that Trump is protecting civil rights. So again, using the same language, right? It is protecting civil rights. It is fighting against discrimination. Again, co-opting all the success and progress achieved as a result of the civil rights movement. And this has been a very successful strategy for the conservatives historically, and it's extremely difficult to counter without education, especially education in social sciences. So that's why, at least partly, Trump is attacking education, and they're using, funding, weaponizing funding, to basically, force universities to cancel DEI, committees, education, etc. Again, without education, it's very hard to combat this strategy. Yeah. I'm going to hand over to maybe Tom.
All right, I'll step up. Hi, my name's Tom Schrand. I'm Associate Dean for General Education here at Jefferson on the East Falls campus. So I have a kind of professional interest in this topic because my job involves overseeing organizing our general education core curriculum, which strongly features education and courses about issues of diversity, both within the United States and globally, which almost every university across the country does or has some kind of diversity requirement. Our accrediting body, the Middle States Association, encourages universities to reflect on diversity, included in their mission, included in their curriculum. So what we're doing here is, is following the recommendations and the actual requirements of our accrediting association. So I've been trying to understand where the Trump administration might be going with this, what its impacts could be on the curriculum that I and my colleagues deliver here at our campus. So there's a few things I've been looking at and trying to parse to understand what's coming and how sharply this could kind of undermine what I consider very good and positive work that our faculty does with our students. So one of the things we can look at is how this happens at the state level, and the states have more freedom, especially over their public universities. So if they are in the hands of a conservative Republican leadership, there's a lot of things they can do to leverage the universities. They can change the trustees, they can change the leadership of the universities, and they can use the trustees to challenge the curriculum and to kind of impose changes on that. So we can see that in Florida under the DeSantis administration. They've been very aggressive in undermining diversity education in the state universities. In fact, they basically have taken over a university. It's called New College in Florida. It's become a fairly famous case in this DeSantis campaign in Florida. It was like a pretty cozy state liberal arts college. It was kind of a haven or a magnet for progressive students, queer students, students with liberal progressive beliefs. And they wanted to make an example of it and kind of transform it from what it is to what they see as a model for conservative forms of education. So they wanted to make it a center of what they call classical liberal education, which is kind of emphasizing the Western canon, Western great books, American civics in a very kind of patriotic way that maybe smooths over some of the challenges that the United States government and people have faced over the centuries. So they've done that. They got rid of They fired the president, they closed down the Gender and Women's Studies department, and they aggressively recruited, they created a football team and aggressively recruited male athletes to change the gender balance and the political makeup of the university. So faculty have fled, a lot of students have fled, they don't feel like it's the school they signed up for any longer. So we're a little insulated from that as a private institution. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania can't really interfere too much with our curriculum, but we see the federal government is using federal funding to extort universities into taking the political stances that they want to see. So we're seeing it now with Columbia just kind of buckled under to federal pressure. They changed their definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of the State of Israel. They put their Department of Middle Eastern Studies under stricter supervision. It's taking it out of the hands of the dean and putting it under the Board of Trustees, our administrative supervision. So just by withholding federal funds, they're kind of able to pressure institutions. So we see that happening. The other thing I've been looking at is the Project 2025 handbook that was put together before the last election. The Trump administration disavowed that it had anything to do with their campaign while they were running for office before the election. Since the election, we've seen that kind of chapter by chapter, this is being carried out in a very rapid and aggressive way. So one of the things I didn't realize until I dug into it, Project 2025, one of the things that's happened with federal funding is they want to change the maximum percentage of, when you get a federal grant, you get a certain percentage of overhead. This is money in addition to your research project that the National Institute of Health or the National Science Foundation gives you that generally goes into the university's operations to keep the lights on, build classrooms, whatever, maybe subsidize student tuition with fellowships or scholarships. They want to limit that to 15% of the total cost of any grant. Now, that doesn't sound like discriminatory in theory, but if you look at Project 2025, they say explicitly if we can reduce these overhead percentages from, in some cases, 50 or 60%, like Jefferson gets from our federal grants, to 15%, they said that's going to take money out of the coffers of the university that could be used to do things like DEI offices, to pay people to do DEI work, or to sponsor curriculum that have DEI content. So even that change to the science funding is targeting the DEI work of universities. The last thing I'll say is that I think I interpret this as a defensive strategy. They see DEI awareness as a threat. They talk about getting rid of the woke mind virus. They don't want us to be woke, which implies they want us to close our eyes and go to sleep, because I think they see the political tides shifting, especially with younger generations, and it's threatening to them. They want to kind of nip it in the bud, weaken universities, and especially weaken the curriculum that we've been developing over the last generation or so. So I'll stop there. I guess is Bryce up?
Yes, but I was wondering, did anyone do a summary of the Dear Colleagues letters that had just come out?
I looked at them.
I made an assumption that would happen by the time it got to me. Do either of you want to talk about that?
I can say that the Dear Colleague letter was a letter that the Department of Education sent out to universities at the beginning of the Trump administration. That letter put universities on notice that they're going to use civil rights law to stop any discrimination in student admissions, and also to stop universities from sponsoring any activities that are race exclusive. So like you can't have a dormitory for black students. You can't have any programs that are restricted to a certain racial group or ethnic group. They do seem to acknowledge that they can't really interfere with curriculum, that there are still some free speech rights universities have to set their curriculum, and that you could have identity-based organizations that are not exclusive. So you could have a black student organization that allows students of other ethnicities or races to join or participate if they like. So that's what I'll say. You can say more about it.
Yeah. Can I piggyback off of that really quickly? Just to say that I think, in many ways, the civil rights law is being misused, right? And sometimes misinterpreted. So in many circumstances, if there is an organization like a Black Student Union, right? In many of these cases, it is never solely restricted to people of that group, right? Regardless of what the group is, right? Anyone is welcome to join. It's what you're learning when you are a member of that group. What is the focus of the group? But in how the Dear Colleague letter and other laws and practices are being framed is as if there's any focus on a particular marginalized group, whether it be in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, then it's necessarily discriminatory, right? Which we know is not true. And just to say one more thing about education is in the K through 12, there have been these attacks over the past 5 years with the anti-CRT and CRT being critical race theory and anti-intersectionality moves, which again is a little bit absurd because in K through 12, critical race theory in general has not been taught. Yeah. It's something that is generally taught at the college level or even in law school, right, in the graduate level. So again, there's a complete the way in which discourse is being used and media is being kind of infiltrated, right, certain parts of media in order to misrepresent what these things are actually doing is paramount. And I think that that's something that we really, really have to pay attention to, how they're using, right, it's back to Gwanji's point, right, how these terms are being misused and intentionally in order to make us think that something is happening that isn't actually happening. And really quickly, I looked online before I came, there are actually a few states, Illinois, New Jersey, and Minnesota have actually instituted anti-book banning measures, meaning that they've instituted laws, their governors have instituted laws that say you cannot ban books between 2023 and 2024. So Illinois 2023, New Jersey 2024, not sure about Minnesota. But there are at least a few states that have pushed back at this educational level, which I think is, exciting, and we need to kind of figure out what they're doing to see if these are things that we need to replicate elsewhere. Okay. It's your guys.
Thank you. So I wanted to connect the legal justification, the Students for Fair Admissions case, to many of the moves that the Trump administration has been doing. So Gwanji mentioned that the Students for Fair Admissions case, which is a case against, they sued both Harvard and UNC, a public school and a private school, saying that those schools' admissions policies, when they considered race, whites and Asians fared worse in admissions decisions. And so previous Supreme Court decisions had already set up, limitations had already set up the rules for how you can consider race in admissions. And the general constitutional test for whether an alleged discrimination on the basis of race, that test is that the state action, which we'll get to in a second, Harvard isn't a state actor that I know of, must be narrowly tailored to a compelling government interest. So regarding the compelling government interest, by the time we got to 2022, the rule was that you could, you could do things that created a more diverse environment, but that you had to do it because you wanted the educational benefits of diversity. A diversity of perspectives in the classroom, the experience of working alongside and with people from different backgrounds and lived experiences, those things were compelling. Righting past wrongs, the Supreme Court said, and many other justifications for affirmative actions, those were not compelling. So how do you narrowly tailor to those compelling government interests? Well, you couldn't do quotas, you couldn't give bonus points if you had a point-based admission system, and you could only consider race when you're making individual admissions decisions, when you're treating the individual as an individual. Okay. So I argue that even though the Supreme Court says that that diversity is no longer, in the 2023 case, they said that it is no longer a compelling government interest. You can still make these arguments, and it's still important to make these arguments. So I just pulled some quotes from the amicus briefs, the Friends of the Court briefs from that case. Many of the amicus briefs mentioned previous Supreme Court precedent, which said that enrolling a diverse student body, this is the Fisher 2 case, UT Austin, unsuccessfully challenging UT Austin's policies. Enrolling a diverse student body promotes cross-racial understanding, helps to break down racial stereotypes, and enables students to better understand persons of different races. A group of military leaders writing to the court in 2022 said, diversity is imperative to our military's dealing with international allies and complex global challenges, which require leaders who can leverage talent, experience, and perspective to reach nuanced and innovative solutions. The Anti-Defamation League, which fights anti-Semitism, said that they found that diversity in higher education is critical, not only because the diverse faculty and student body bring different experiences and viewpoints to the campus, but also because diversity can help foster a just and inclusive society and mitigate against racial and ethnic discrimination and hate. The American Bar Association quoted Judge Edward Chen's 2003 article in which he said, how can the public, so we're talking about diversity in legal education, how can the public have confidence and trust in such an institution as the courts, the legal institution, if it is segregated, if the communities it is supposed to protect are excluded from its ranks? The kind of primo HR policy organization, the most fancy HR people in the country, the HR Policy Association, says, breaking down racial and ethnic barriers to permit constructive interaction between people of different backgrounds should be an objective with which there is no dispute. One important way to accomplish this objective is to increase the diversity and leadership in the business community. So when the justices were making their decision in that 2023 case, they thought that they were really cute. In 2003, in a University of Michigan decision, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote, in upholding the race-based admissions in that case, that we expect, this is 2003, we expect that 25 years from now, counting that's 2028, it's in the future, but also imagined, fake, something she pulled out of thin air, we expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest of proof today. Well, the Supreme Court got really excited that they had a majority and that they could beat that clock. Okay. So now that decision is being used to make all kinds of policy justifications. And I mentioned earlier that when you are making a constitutional argument, you have to claim that that it's based on one of the amendments to the Constitution. Typically, you usually need to make an argument that the government is doing something to you, right? That there's a state action that is harming your rights. Well, Harvard isn't a state actor, but sometimes private actors can be pulled into the fold, and we have rules for that. Gonji actually said this was actually the most dominant argument at the time. Well, Harvard might need to follow the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Well, when you look at the decision, the majority of the justices who gave us the final decision decided that they didn't even want to talk about that. They didn't even want to bother talking about how to justify whether, or how to argue that Harvard was a state actor. They just said Harvard's violating the Constitution. They're just making up rules at this point, right? This is it's very insider baseball. It's very something that only lawyers understand, right? But usually you have to go through that analysis. If you're in my classes, at least a few of you are, you gotta do the IRAC. How is Harvard a state actor, right? You have to propose the issue. Harvard is a state actor. You have to explain what the rule for state actors is, and you need to apply the rules to this case. Or invent new rules. You're the Supreme Court, you can do that. They refuse to do it. It's kind of weird because there was something right there. Justices Gorsuch and Thomas did say that, okay, yes, we did vote in the majority. All 6 of us said that it violates the Constitution, but we also think it would violate the Civil Rights Act. Only 2 justices. What's that all about? Well, it's because they want to be able to make up rules. They want to be able to ignore proper conventions, and it kind of passed under the radar because it's it's a weird small point, right? It's a technicality. Okay. So, breaking rules, coming up with new standards without really explaining that we're coming up with new standards. That might sound familiar now. So we've received the Dear Colleague letter, and since then we've seen that the federal government, as Thomas pointed out, the federal government has shown that it's willing to punish higher education institutions for decisions that they made in the past. For Penn allowing a trans athlete to swim on the swim team 3 years ago, explicitly, that's what they said. For Columbia and Harvard refusing to stop anti-Semitism on campus. And their funds, specific federal funds were taken from these universities for that. And concessions were made, at least in the case of Columbia. So we're creating rules, but we're not really explaining how we're creating those rules. We're not really explaining what the new rules are, how to follow the new rules. At the same time, the administration is going after various students without citizenship, some permanent residents, some longtime visa holders, some student visa holders. when they've been identified as protesting Israeli action against the Palestinian people, when they have had law enforcement interactions surrounding pro-Palestine protests. Permanent resident Mahmoud Khalil is being detained because the Secretary of State has deemed him a threat to national security based on his activism on the Columbia campus. Same with Ramesa Öztürk on a student visa at Tufts, who was picked up in an arrest filmed on a security camera, which was circulated widely. Cornell student Mamadou Tal and Columbia student Ranjani Srinivasan, both on student visas, deported themselves instead of facing U.S. Homeland Security actions. The actions are clear. The purpose behind the actions are clear. Öztürk and Khalil were moved to ICE detention facilities on the other end of the country in what seems to be a purposeful decision to gum up procedures to make it more difficult to question administration policies and just to do whatever they want.
I guess continuing the legal discussion, to make things clear, the DEI thing is really three-pronged, and I think we have to understand that. The first is what Marilisa talked about, was education. Well, we can educate our students, whether it's in lower or upper levels. That's one. The second thing is in hiring. And just to make it perfectly clear, nobody in the DEI situation is hiring unqualified people. That is the mantra of the right. That's not happening. What's happening is giving equal access to the jobs. That's different than hiring someone who's unqualified because of their race. Big difference between the two. So let's define reality, which I know is hard these days. And the third part is discrimination. So there's three parts that you're not allowed to discriminate against people, whether it's race, religion, or sexual preference, once they're hired. So it's three-pronged. So I just wanted to say foundation. And those are the things being threatened. Nobody's being hired because they're black or a woman who's unqualified. So let's just have the right discussion instead of the nonsense. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the law as it exists has to be non-ambiguous. Trump administration is not allowing illegal DEI. The phrase illegal DEI has not been defined. And when you look at the foundation I just gave you, what is illegal in what's going on other than you say it's illegal? So right now what the Trump administration is doing, because I think at least someone there understands the illegality of their actions, and opposing judges who are actually saying what you're doing is illegal, they're using the threat of money. And that's not to arrest anybody, that's not to make anyone lose their jobs directly. What they're saying is, you listen to us or be scared of us, and I'll cover that in a minute, and we will get what we want, otherwise you don't get the money. Now, in a nation of law, and Bryce and I both studied law, and we were trained that this was a nation of law, that we have a Constitution. The Constitution under Article 1 and 2 does not give the president the power of money, period. That is a congressional right. The fact that he has seized it means it's an unconstitutional action. Now, if that matters or not, that's a different situation. As a person who respected the law, I'm incredibly offended by that. But it is what it is. But even worse is the fear that's put out there. It's almost a McCarthyism when they were arresting or taking people's jobs because of their existing First Amendment rights that didn't exist at the time. People started shutting up and not protesting or not saying anything against Eisenhower and so forth. And what we have is that fear. And we just had a speaker here the other day, Amanda Marcotte from, and a lot of you came, and she was wonderful. She's a very strong feminist writer with very definite ideas for Salon. And when I asked this university to publicize it, I was told we can't publicize it. And you know why? Because they're afraid, because she is not exactly an admirer of our current president, okay? That fear is chilling First Amendment rights and chilling everything, because although we're private, we get lots of money downtown, and if those grants dry up, we dry up. So we're shutting up. So what's going on now is we have an administration defining a law without a definition, attacking something that's actually not happening, the hiring, just throwing it out there as the raw meat for the people who believe the way they do and acting illegally against the Constitution. And it doesn't matter because no one's enforcing the Constitution. Federal judges are trying, but he's ignoring. And when I taught con law before Bryce did, I used to say to the class, I said, what happens if the Supreme Court, assuming they're not corrupt, issues a law and the president says no? What happens? And they would look at me like, what do you mean? Like, how? And I go, well, what happened? And the answer is nothing. Because the Supreme Court doesn't have a police force, the federal court doesn't have a police force. What happens if Trump says, against these numerous court decisions that have come out, saying what he's doing is ambiguous, because what is illegal DEI? It has no definition. You can't have an ambiguous law. And putting rules against him enforcing, he's enforcing it anyway. What happens then? Does the federal court have an army? So it all comes down to, and I hate to put it, is who controls the army? And that's where we are right now. And I hate to be negative on that, but the DEI is just a very strong example of unconstitutional action. The individual Bryce brought up, arrested, because he was arrested, that's what it was, without due process, without being told what his crime is, without the ability for a lawyer to defend himself in a court of law. All these people who were brought down to El Salvador, and Christy Nomes with her, won't comment on how she looked in front of all the prisoners, saying that we're going to prosecute you if you're illegal. Well, I have a definition for prosecution. Prosecutors charge, either through grand jury or they charge. 2, you're allowed due process. You're allowed to defend yourself in a court of law. If you're accused of being a terrorist, the government, beyond a reasonable doubt, has to prove that. If you are accused of being part of an illegal gang, the government has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. If you committed illegal activity, the government has to prove that. But these people were deported, they were kidnapped. They weren't deported, they were kidnapped. But when we don't follow the law, what matters? So DEI, to sum up what I'm saying, I brought up a lot of things, but DEI is just a really strong symptom of a government acting without constitutional authority, against due process, against the 14th Amendment, against the First Amendment, against the Sixth Amendment. This is what we're left with. But the Eagles did win the Super Bowl, so I'll leave that on positive.
Yeah, to follow your point, Evan, I would describe what's happening right now as an intimidation campaign. Earlier, is today April 1st? I guess it was in March, last month.
April 1st for the last 3 months.
Last month, the department, I guess 3 different government agencies sent out a letter to, I think it was the 60 largest U.S. universities, putting them on notice that they were going to be under review for their failure to protect Jewish students on their campuses. So I looked at the list of 60. It's what you would expect. A lot of them were big public universities, mostly in blue states. There's one in Florida, there's one in Arizona, but mostly kind of East and West Coast universities. They weren't saying that, they weren't accusing them. I mean, they were saying you're going to be investigated. So they didn't say they had done anything wrong or proven that they'd done anything wrong. Just be aware. We're going to be watching you and looking into your behavior around these protests and your protection of Jewish students on your campus. So that is, I mean, it's kind of what they did to Columbia, and they got what they wanted. So they're kind of testing how, if we twist their arms, like what can we get out of them? Like how far can we push them? Even if everything we're threatening is not legal, maybe wouldn't hold up in court, maybe you'd be ruled down in court. But in the meantime, let's see how much fear we can instill, how much self-censorship or preemptive compliance we can create at these institutions. So it's discouraging to see like a Columbia with, I don't know how many billion are in their endowment, but that this threat of taking the federal money away, which is probably a false threat because it probably wouldn't hold up in court, but how much the Trump administration got out of Columbia just by doing that. I mentioned at the beginning that our curriculum is guided by our accreditor, the Middle States Association. The other thing in Project 2025 that's being put into action now is going after the accreditation agencies and forbidding them from requiring any kind of DEI statements or mission or education. So they can't include that in their accreditation requirements, which is what you need. You have to get accreditation for you to get federal funding or to take student loans from the federal government. So they're trying to weaken that, and they're also trying to build in religious exemptions for private institutions that want to discriminate against gay students or trans students or students of different religious beliefs. So they're trying to stifle the public schools, and then they're trying to create this safe space for private religious-based schools that would promote their preferred line of education. So all this stuff is kind of happening together in multiple fronts, in multiple directions, illegally often or of questionable legality, but they're getting the results that they were hoping to get. So so far it's working.
Yeah, I mean, quickly underlining something Tom just said is, and it relates to something Evan was talking about. Columbia was told that it was not doing enough, and this, that, and the other thing, and I think they had already tried to. They'd already been working on some of these things, but as Tom pointed out, they did capitulate. They did exactly. They changed things exactly how the Trump administration wanted them to change things, despite the fact that I don't think that's really how they would have done it on their own. So an option that they had would just be to use the endowment, the many billions of dollars that they have, to kind of to fund any research that would be defunded in the meantime, right? To challenge that. So it's kind of cowardly to not do that, right? To not do things the way you want to do them, especially when you think that the government is acting unconstitutionally. And the interim president who made that deal has already stepped down, so who knows what's going to happen with that. And regarding, governments not abiding by the Supreme Court, we don't really know if the Trump administration is acting very strangely with district court judges' decisions or very erratically with district court judge decisions. We don't necessarily know how they'll react to the Supreme Court decisions based on these current policies, because the Supreme Court moves slowly and it takes a while to get there too. So, we also don't know if the Supreme Court's what the Supreme Court will allow, and I think he'll probably get some wins. But there is, a very notable case, and it's very on topic to this conversation. It's a very notable case of governments ignoring Supreme Court precedent, which is various local governments and school districts ignoring the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education too, right? It took 30, 40 years for the South to desegregate its schools. And it's not because it takes a while to figure it out, it's because they were resisting, right? Because they didn't want black students in white schools. And so, there is precedent for this. It's a reminder that of the importance of fighting for what is right, which, sadly Columbia didn't do. We'll see what Penn and Harvard do. We'll see who becomes maybe universities will show that they truly do not have spines. And we'll have someone else show themselves to be the defender of what is right. So that's what I'll say about that. And then I will just say, there are these straw man, for I don't know what other expressions there are for straw man arguments for why DEI is bad, and we see already the University of California, I believe, has stopped requiring diversity statements for job applications. When you're applying for a job at the University of California, you used to have to give a diversity statement. You no longer have to do so. Well, that's maybe a reminder. Those things are not. There's people who disagree with those things across the spectrum, right? So I think it's important to, just as it's important to talk about why we value diversity, if we do, I think it's important to talk about what the means are that we promote diversity and which ones are good and which ones are bad, because there are many critiques of of needing to show your diversity bona fides when you know, there are people whose whole life, whose whole work is thinking about diversity, and they're like, really, you're gonna make me write a separate thing about how much I value diversity? What's this for? What's this about? What are you trying to prove here? What's the performance that I'm doing here? So, I think, you know, like that news is just a reminder that there, you know, we can think more purposefully about the kinds of things that we want to do in order to promote the values that we care about.
I want to point out one thing. Roberts did say, Roberts wrote the majority opinion in the Harvard case, UNC case. And he said this, he said that prohibiting the use of race in admissions did not stop universities from considering a student's discussion on how race had affected them, so long as the discussion is concretely tied to quality of character and unique ability. Which is really not that different if you look at it from what was going on before, because you had Botke and Grunier, there's a case you're talking about. In those cases, you had quotas. And they said very clearly, no quotas, but you can consider it. So as long as there's no point system, as you put, or there isn't any guaranteed amount, even Roberts is saying that diversity can be looked at as a whole of the person. So when you look at what the Trump administration is trying to interpret, they're going much further than Roberts would even go, and he wrote the majority opinion, because he's still allowing it in there. It just can't be a checkbox, it can't be a percentage, it can't be a point system, or obviously a quota. So this is going way beyond, because they're saying no DEI, and he's not saying that. And I don't see any discussion of that. I mean, they're quoting the concurring opinions, but those are not the majority opinions. So that's not law. Anyone else in the audience would like to take on what they've heard? Go right ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
Besides, like what you mentioned about the 15% cut on the overhead costs for the federal grants and the fear of publicizing that feminist speaker, do you think at Jefferson University, have you noticed any other like blatant disregard for DEI? I know the websites are still up, not like UPenn where they, you know, as some of my colleagues said, cut their losses, quote unquote. But just wondering if, like, you have any take on what Jefferson specifically is doing now.
I think to give Jefferson a little bit here, right in the middle of all this, we had someone actually appointed to a position, which was Marilisa. Marilisa, you want to tell us what your position is?
Yeah, I started a position as Assistant Provost of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I was supposed to start in the fall, but I had some health stuff, and so I started in the spring. So, you know, amidst this chaos, you know, I've started this position, and you know, am working with the Associate Provost of DEI, who's held his position for, I want to say, more than a decade or something. And, you know, we have DEI committees within each college, or if not each college, then most colleges that continue to do the work that they do. You know, and so I have been told that my position will continue to be supported, that, you know, I will continue to be able to do this work here. And so I think that's promising, given, you know, the circumstances that we're in. What that will look like, you know, in 1 year or 6 months, I don't know, right? Like, it's possible for things to change. But yeah, I mean, I think that's not a small thing, right? Given the circumstances that we're in right now.
Yeah, we also have a very unique organization, right? We have, you know, a large chunk of the organization is a hospital system that really serves the public and serves everyone in the public, right? So I think because money is being hung over people's heads in weird and uncomfortable and violent ways, I think we're kind of, I don't know, like I don't know if there's other universities like us, private institutions that provide such important care to their communities. The federal dollars can make really big difference in what we do, but that being said, it seems like we are, I don't know, don't know what else I can say about it, but if they would ever care about us and try to take money away, that would be very significant. So who knows what they would do, but the threat would be we don't have as big of an endowment as Columbia and Penn and the others.
It really doesn't make much difference in
Yeah.
what they do.
Yeah.
And I would also want to second that. I think our leadership, just from a distance watching what's happening, I think they're working with their legal team. They're assessing what's a real threat and what could be, a threat that dissolves under scrutiny of courts. And they haven't shown any signs of doing anything preemptively to, appease the Trump administration. That we're going to continue on our path until legally we're told that there's certain things we can't do. But we had a health equity conference down in Center City just in the last month or two, so that was proudly announced and publicized by the university. All of our diversity offices and programming is still seems to be underway. So websites haven't changed. It's just business as usual for now. There could be real legal reasons why we have to change certain things, but so far we're not there.
We just have a couple of minutes. Does anyone else have, that was a very good question. Does anyone else have any questions before we wrap up? Comments? Go ahead.
I'm just curious to know, as students, constituents, just everyday people, what can we do? I mean, I think that we see this discourse in the media, and when our existence is constantly being an argument and a discussion in classrooms and in politics, you ask yourself, what can I do? Do I stay silent? Do I wait for a response? Do I wait for what's next? Is there something that I can do? And I'm just curious to know what you all have to say in that aspect.
I saw a lot of protests here about the 76ers going to Chinatown, which was a significant issue. I don't see anything about First Amendment. I don't see anything about people being picked up without due process. While you still have First Amendment rights, I would strongly advise you to use them.
There are protests, to remember what they're called, but there are protests happening nationally on Saturday.
Yeah.
12 to 3 p.m. Yeah, there's one at City Hall, and all across the country. Does anybody remember what they're called? The
Hands off, right?
Yes, thank you. So there are hands-off protests happening, intermittently. I think that the question of, I've asked myself the same question, right? Like I do this work and I do this, I'm able to talk about these things in my classes. And then I'm like, okay, what do I do like off campus? And I think that that's hard. I think while you have the capacity and in spaces where you can say something, you also have to protect yourself, right? Especially if you're someone who's in a position where you could be harmed or injured or attacked in some sort of way. And so you have to kind of be cognizant of where that might happen. And so don't, right, in spaces where you sense that. But if there are spaces where you can say something, then do, whether those are at protests or, at some sort of gathering, right? Bringing these things up in classes where you're not supposed to be talking about it, but you can, right? Like that's, I think, a useful thing to do because it gets stuff out there in spaces where it maybe otherwise wouldn't be. And just think about where you feel like you hold weight in your life and use that, right? Like lean into that and also find community with other people. I think being alone is a dangerous thing right now. And I think when you can be with other people and talk with other people and you can say, we feel this way, not just I feel this way, we've been talking about this, we're doing this together, that's where we're gonna have strength, right? If universities decide to come together instead of waiting to be individually, right, like treated, but saying like, we are gonna come together and do something, that feels like that can make a huge difference, right? And I think that that's the kind of thinking that we have to take on.
Thank you all for joining today's important discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education in the Trump era. The administration's recent actions, including executive orders targeting DEI programs and investigations into university policies, have significantly impacted academic institutions nationwide. Thank you to the Jefferson faculty and Marilisa for guiding these important conversations. As these changes continue to unfold, it is crucial that we stay informed and engaged in what is happening with our universities. Let's continue advocating for inclusive policies and ensuring that higher education remains a space for diversity, equity, and meaningful discussion. The roundtables are on our YouTube and SoundCloud, and we are broadcasted on the first and third Sundays of each month from 7 to 8 a.m. on G-Town Radio 92.5 FM WGGT. Thanks for listening and have a great day.